Welcome back to the archive, Dr. Brian Regal. So today I'm excited we're going to be talking about the start of cryptozoology and Grover Krantz, very influential figure in it. Also, if I got my research correctly, you were somebody who also leading up to your book on the Jersey Devil. You're somebody that had access or was like one of the first people that looked at some unreviewed papers of his at the Smithsonian Museum.
Oh yeah, I I got the idea. I'm one of these people who has like 10 book ideas in his head at once. And when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I originally wanted to do my doctoral dissertation called Darwin and the Monsters, as a way of looking at how scientists, learned persons throughout time have dealt with monsters, because there's this kind of trope that scientists don't believe in monsters, and they make fun of people who do, which is not the case at all. If you actually look at the history, which my favorite phrase that I teach my students is, it's all fun and games until a historian shows up. And so I wanted to do this kind of long survey, long history of cryptozoology, but I wasn't sure whether the committee, the university, would let me do something like that, and so I wound up doing the thing that I did do, which was on this guy Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was the longtime head of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Fascinating character. He's the guy who created the name Velociraptor. He's the guy who gave the name Tyrannosaurus. He's largely forgotten today, unfortunately. But in his day, in the early 20th century, the only other scientist in America who was more famous than him and more well known to the public was Albert Einstein. Everybody remembers Einstein. Nobody really remembers Osborn anymore. So I did Osborn because dinosaurs, religious conflict about evolution, and so I didn't get to do the Darwin project. And when I finished my dissertation, I got it published. I said, okay, now I'm going to do the Darwin project. And then this publisher, Greenwood, came to me and said, oh, we want you to do this book, sort of a general audience book on controversies in human evolution. And so I said yes, because, a book in the hand is worth two not in the hand. And so that took me about a year and a half to do. And I got done with that. I said, okay, now I'm going to do the Darwin book. And then I started thinking about, well, what do I want to write about? I have all these ideas about monsters and amateurs versus professionals, science versus religion. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do something about amateur investigators and professional scientists. So I started working on that. And in the Human Evolution Controversies book, I did a chapter on ancient America and the mounds and the Native American artifacts and all of that stuff, which basically became the book I just published.
And it's a great book. People can find it in the
Thanks.
description.
Yes, that became the Columbus book, which just came out. But at the time, I said, okay, I'm going to do this book. I want to do a chapter on Grover Krantz. And I said, okay, well, I'll jump on a plane. I'll head all the way the hell out to Washington, and the state of Washington, not Washington, D.C., but the state of Washington. And I'll sit down with this guy. We'll have a chat, and that will become the basis of that chapter. But before I could do that, I discovered he was dead. He had died like the year before I started the project. So then, I poked around a little bit and I found out that his family, his estate, had left all of his writings, all of his letters, his notebooks, all the stuff that historians just, get giddy about, and had left it to the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian put it in the National Anthropological Archive, which is just outside Washington, D.C. So I hop on a train and get on the Amtrak, head down there, and it's a huge collection, much larger than I thought. And I started going through it because this is what historians do. We're always looking for the letters, the notebooks, the paperwork. We're really focused on paperwork. And so I start going through it, and I'm realizing not only is there a huge amount of material here, but there's material on all the other famous cryptozoologists of the mid 20th century. And I'm beginning to realize that this Krantz guy was far more pivotal to this whole story than I had ever thought. So I wound up going through all of it. And very quickly I realized this is not a chapter. This is a whole book by itself. So I put the Darwin thing aside and I said, okay, I'm gonna write this book about sort of the history of cryptozoology. And because he was so integrated into all of this, in the sort of post-war period up until he dies in the early 20th century, Grover Krantz is involved with everything about cryptozoology. Everyone, he's one of these guys that you can throw a dart at a wall on everything that's happened in cryptozoology, and you almost always hit Grover Krantz. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to do this book. I'm going to use Krantz as this kind of vehicle by which to tell the story of cryptozoology. I like to take, as a historian, I like to take the approach of tell the small story to tell the big story.
Okay, and what made it important? What makes it important in your writings to tell the small story to tell the big story?
Because my experience is that people, readers, tend to latch on to characters. If you talk about sort of big ideas, and if I was gonna write a book about World War II, let's say, there's 8 billion books out there about World War II. But they tend to talk in big terms, the air war, the war of the factories, the this, the that, and they don't always focus on individual people. Sometimes you get a focus on like a general or something. And I want to, when I do all my books are like this, I like to find 1 or 2 or 3 kind of characters, like in a movie. In a movie, you got a couple of characters that whether they're good guys or bad guys, whatever, the narrative revolves around these characters, and those characters are used to tell this bigger story. And so that's why I say, use the small story to tell the big story. So the small story here is the life of Grover Krantz. My book, Searching for Sasquatch, is basically a biography of Grover Krantz. And by using Grover Krantz, because he occupied this pivotal place in 20th century cryptozoology, I could use his story to tell this much broader picture of chasing monsters in the 20th century.
Now, what made Grover Krantz pivotal? Like, what made his position unique, his credentials unique to?
Yeah, well, this gets back to this idea that this idea that isn't actually correct, that scientists always ignored cryptozoology. And that's not the case at all. I mean, we can go. One of the things I'm doing I got back now that the Columbus book is done, I can take a crack again at the Darwin book. An interest in what we can sort of loosely call monsters goes all the way back to the classical world. Aristotle, Pliny, Lucretius in The Nature of Things talks about monsters. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's discussions of monsters. Monsters are everywhere in the ancient world. And learned persons, because there's no such thing as a scientist yet, that still has 2,500 years to go before anything like a scientist comes along. But guys like Pliny and Aristotle, Lucretius, when they looked at monsters, they said, okay, we need to find out whether these things are real or not. Because if they're not real, then we can just discard them as folklore, they're not real. But if they are real, they have to fit logically into the greater realm of biological diversity on Earth. One of the things that these ancient early biologists start doing, because this is where we see the birth of biology, is they say, okay, there's this vast number of living things on Earth of all kinds. Some are similar, some are really different from each other. Where do they come from, and why are they so different, and why do they inhabit the places they inhabit? And so the idea that if monsters are real, they have to fit into the scheme somewhere. And so that's what they start doing. That's what these early, they didn't use the term cryptozoologist. They didn't even often use the term monster. But these unusual creatures, we need to study them. To study these creatures is a perfectly reasonable scientific pursuit. And what we're going to wind up with either is knowing that they're not real, so we don't have to worry about them anymore, or that they are real, and then we figure out where do they fit in the great chain of being. And that continues on until the 17th century, 18th century, into the 19th century. I mean, Darwin was interested in monsters. I've seen his letters. I've seen books where in the margins where there's this famous book that comes out in the 1840s by a very important French biologist, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. You got to say it with an outrageous French accent.
Outrageous French accent.
Yes. And he writes this very important book on human and animal monsters. And Darwin's got a hold of a copy of it, and it just fascinates the crap out of him. And I've seen his copy; it's in Cambridge, in the Cambridge University Library, and his marginal notes are all over it, in pencil. So you're actually looking at this book, and you can see Charles Darwin writing in the margins his thoughts about monsters and how does he fit this into the concept of natural selection. So, and he wasn't the only one. A lot of those 19th century early evolution guys thought about monsters because they thought, again, if these things are real, we can learn something about generation. We can learn something about evolution from studying them.
Okay, but I gotta know quickly, what was Darwin's favorite monsters?
I have no idea. I never
That's
really
felt that comes to mind.
I never really found a spot where he said, I love those Scipodii, those guys with the giant feet. I think in the end, he didn't really take it that seriously because he thought, excuse me, that these must be misidentifications, that these creatures really don't exist. We're getting these sort of traveler's tales, and this during the late 19th century, this is where science starts to lose its interest in monsters, because now you have people who can study this stuff more thoroughly, and they're just discovering that none of this is real. These are all sort of made up things. And the the guy I sometimes call the godfather of cryptozoology, Richard Owen, who was a contemporary of Darwin's. Owen was, if you know anything about 19th century English science, Owen is at the top of the food chain. Very famous. He helped start the British Museum in London, but he also investigated sea monsters. A lot of his papers are at the British Museum in London, and he had a scrapbook. This is Richard Owen. He had this scrapbook that he kept newspaper articles and letters and things. And because he was well known, the British Admiralty, whenever they received a report of a sea monster, they sent the reports to Owen and said, could you take a look at this and see, what's going on here? And so he kind of had, I guess the equivalent today would be, we're seeing a lot of stuff about the U.S. government and UFOs. I don't know if you've been following this. The
More
last
recent reports, or
yeah, the last year or so, there's been, all these people saying, "Oh, the government has here's this video footage," and and Owen sort of occupied that place in the 19th century British government. When they got monster stories, they sent them to Owen to say, could you take a look at this and see what you think about it? And so he kept all this stuff in a scrapbook, which is still there. You can go to the British Museum in their library, and you can request it, and they'll bring it out and they'll show it to you, and they'll let you, stick your sticky fingers all over it. And he basically comes out and says, these sea monster stories are, one, misidentifications, and two, figments of people's imagination. And because Owen was so high up on the scientific food chain, other naturalists began to say, well, if Owen thinks this is, nonsense, it must be. And so it's in the late 19th century that you start to see this fall off of scientists willing to look at monster stories, because now we know they're not real. Why should I waste my time looking at something that we now know is not real? Partly similar to how very few modern scientists are willing to look at UFOs because they're not real. No reputable scientist or graduate student is going to risk their career by getting involved with this stuff that doesn't exist. And so that's what starts happening in the late 19th century about monsters. And what that does, just like what it's doing now for UFOs, is this kind of vacuum opens up where the scientists have left this behind and nobody's doing anything about it. You get all these amateurs, non-scientists, non-scholars, non-academics who, well, I shouldn't say no. There's a couple floating around out there, but they say the scientists, the eggheads, they're refusing to look at this. We'll go look at it and we'll prove them all wrong, and we'll prove that these monsters, the Bigfoot is real and the Yeti is real, and you can all kiss our asses, and we're smarter than you are with your fancy degrees and your affiliations and things. And so that begins in the early 20th century. Now, one exception to that is a Netherlandish naturalist named Cornelius Oudemans, who writes this book, In the Wake of the Sea Serpents. And it becomes very popular. It doesn't last very long. A few amateurs pick up on it, but then it kind of disappears. And he argued that basically there are so many reports of, I'm sorry, it wasn't In the Wake of the Sea Serpents, that came later. Oudemans' book was The Great Sea Serpent. And he said, look, there's all these reports from reputable people seeing sea monsters. We wouldn't have this many reports if they weren't really being seen. So he basically argues that all these people can't be wrong, so sea monsters must exist. But then his work sort of drifts into obscurity. What really begins cryptozoology, and again, the word does not exist yet. We're into the early 20th century. The two things that really get what we now call cryptozoology going is the abominable snowman and the Loch Ness monster. The abominable snowman is first comes into the Western consciousness in the early 1920s, because that's when you start getting these British mountaineers who all want to climb Mount Everest. And so you have Europeans swarming over Mount Everest in Nepal because they want to be. It has recently been determined that Mount Everest, which to the local Sherpa peoples known as Chumalungma, they want to be the first ones to climb to the highest point in the earth. I want to be the first one to climb it. So you got Englishmen, you got French, you got Germans, you got some Americans running around there. And they start hearing these stories from the local Sherpa people about these creatures that live there, that are running around in the snow. And a journalist hears this story, and he sends back a report to a local newspaper in India, big newspaper in India, telling the story that there's this creature running around. And he mistranslates the Sherpa word for this creature. And to make a long story short, when the article gets published, they call the creature the abominable snowman. And that, of course, boom, that's got star power written all over it, and it becomes a big thing. The other word that we think the Sherpa people used was mete, which in a very loose translation means that thing over there.
Okay,
So
so
that's
it's
what the
that thing over
Sherpa people refer to it as that thing over there. And so this kind of starts sort of Yeti madness, and everybody's into it and talking about it. And then a few years after that, in Scotland, of course, at Loch Ness, there's a long history, a long mythology about a thing that lives in Loch Ness. And some pictures are taken. This is in the early 30s, including the famous or infamous, depending upon which way you look at it, the surgeon's picture, and that kind of gets. So now we have the Yeti, abominable snowman, and the Loch Ness monster, all within about a decade of each other, and people are now getting very kind of worked up about monsters again. Where the modern concept comes from is you got these two guys. You have Ivan Sanderson, who is a Scots biologist, and then a Belgian zoologist named Bernard Heuvelmans. I have a friend who is from Belgium, and she always gets mad at me because I always mispronounce Belgian names. And she got to the point where she just said, look, you Americans, you ruin everybody's language. You mispronounce everything. Just say it whatever way you want. But she used to get mad because Oudemans, that's not that's what it looks like. An American looking at the way it's spelled would say Oudemans, Heuvelmans. It looks, okay, Heuvelmans, that seems, but no, the accents, we get all the accents wrong. But anyway, they start looking at this stuff, And then there's a German named Willy Ley, who is a paleontologist who turns himself into a rocket engineer. He has basically no training as an engineer. He's trained as a paleontologist, but he decides he wants to build rockets. And so he's in Germany, and he's right at the birth of rocketry in Germany. And you might see where this is going. He's got a friend and student named Werner von Braun, and they formed some of the first rocket clubs in the world, and they start building rockets and firing off rockets. And where von Braun was willing to use his expertise for the Nazis, Willy Ley refuses. He says, I hate the Nazis. The Nazis are horrible. And he leaves Germany, comes to America, and he kind of creates a career, like sort of a public career, out of being a rocket scientist, even though he really isn't a rocket scientist. The plastic model kit company, Monogram, they put out a number of plastic model kits of sort of futuristic spaceships, saying, here's Willy Ley's design for a spaceship, and his pictures on the cover, and he
There's the
also writes a
edge.
series of really influential books on his actual training, which is paleontology. But he begins to write books about monsters, sea monsters, and other things. And he doesn't use the word cryptozoology. He calls it romantic zoology, which I always thought was better than cryptozoology, but whatever. And so while all that's going on, these two guys, Sanderson and Heuvelmans, they're not hooked up initially, but they're reading about each other's work. And so the story goes, and when I looked into the archives and things, this is what I found, that it was Heuvelmans who comes up with the word cryptozoology, the study of unknown animals. Later on, Ivan Sanderson claimed, no, I did that. I came up with that word. And after Heuvelmans dies, Ivan Sanderson's running around saying, no, I invented the word cryptozoology. That was me, not Heuvelmans. And they work together on the Minnesota Iceman, and they begin sort of popularizing this notion of cryptozoology. So we could call Ivan Sanderson and Bernard Heuvelman the sort of fathers of cryptozoology, with maybe Willy Ley being kind of like a stepdad.
And so it took off from there. That's what helped
Right.
really.
Yeah. This is 1950s,
Okay.
1950s, 1960s.
All right. Now, was this, now I'm curious about this. Was the public media at the time, because everybody loves to watch infamous bad 1950s B movies.
Right.
Was this also by chance the same time that it was of the public interest too? It was in the media, or did it help inspire a change within the media landscape?
Well, there is a great movie. I'm sure you probably saw it, called was it called The Abominable Snowman? Black and white movie, uh with the guy who often played, he was in all those movies of the period, all those sort of horror science fiction movies. He was the guy in Star Wars, the governor on the Death Star, who decides they should blow up Alderaan. But he's in this, and along with Forrest Tucker, who was more famous from F Troop. I don't know if you might be too young to remember F Troop. He was
I have the series DVD still.
Oh, okay. So so Forrest Tucker was the sergeant from F Troop, and they're in this movie, and they go up to the Himalayas to catch a yeti, and they're gonna throw a net over it, and then put in a cage and bring it back. That sounds crazy, but there were actually people in Nepal, Westerners, in particular, this one weird Russian guy. It's like, do you really need to add the word weird to Russian guy in Nepal? And that was their plan. He was going to get cages and metal fencing and make a trap and capture an abominable snowman and bring him back to the West, put him on display. So that came from an actual plan of an actual guy who thought he was going to be able to do this. And so,
Drinking the whole time?
I'm sorry.
Was he drinking the whole time?
I don't know. But that does get some pop culture traction. But what really launches monsters, what I call anomalous primates. Because if Bigfoot's real, which it probably isn't, but if it is real, it's some kind of primate. It's some kind of ape, monkey, something. So an anomalous primate, we don't know what it is. In 1958 in California, because a state road construction crew, Northern California, heavily forested, very few ways to go through. And so what the state of California decides to do is we'll build roads up into these really dense parts of the California forest, because if there's a forest fire, you can't get fire trucks in there. So we have to build a series of roads and trails so that if something like that or if a plane crashes, that we can get to them. And so this one crew is up there, they're chopping down trees, and they've got a bulldozer, and they're building these access roads. And this one particular crew of guys, they find themselves, when they finish for the day, they leave the equipment there and they go down into town, and then they come back the next day, and they push the road a little bit further, and they come back and they notice in the dirt of the trail that they've created so far has these huge footprints, human-like footprints in the dirt. And at first, it's odd, but it doesn't really, they don't really do anything about it. But as time goes by, every day when they come back around the bulldozer, around the other equipment, there's these huge footprints in the dirt. And they start calling it Bigfoot, because it's a big foot leaving these human-like prints. And that gets into that gets into the local newspaper, and then it goes all over the place. And so that's how Bigfoot is born. Then they discover that the local native people, I guess I shouldn't say local native people, because the native people of the whole sort of Pacific Northwest, which is a huge area stretching all the way up into Canada and Alaska, they apparently have, in their mythology, in their folklore, they have these large human, they don't use the word ape because they haven't seen apes yet, but huge human-like creatures that they assume is some kind of spirit animal running around. And again, because we ruin everybody's language, the word they're using gets kind of bastardized into Sasquatch. And so now you have Sasquatch and you have Bigfoot. And those names really just take off in the media. How could they not? And this is like the late 50s, early 60s. And the other thing that really kind of kicks this into overdrive is that in 1959, a couple of cowboy types named Roger Patterson and Robert Gimlin. They decide, we know that area where these Bigfoot things supposedly are wandering around. Let's pack up in there, and maybe we can get some pictures, some film of it, which we can sell. We can make a killing. So they head up there, and they're on horseback because, again, the reason these construction crews are there are to build these roads so that you can get in and out of this place. But they're on horses, and they come around a bend in sort of an open area by a stream, and right up in front of them is this huge 8-foot tall, hairy, ape-like creature. And Patterson grabs his film camera and he starts filming. The horse he's on rears up. He almost falls off, but he manages to, remain calm enough to grab his camera, and he goes running after the thing, filming as he's running. And he winds up shooting 15 or 20 seconds worth of footage, which forever becomes known as the Patterson film. And that starts getting circulated around, and it winds up on TV. And so this, to this day, the Patterson film is thought to be proof that Bigfoot / Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, is a real living creature. That gets the attention of a new professor of paleoanthropology at Washington State University named Grover Krantz. I hesitate to say young professor, because by the time he gets hired by Washington State, he's not that young anymore. He's had a bit of a rocky career up to this point, but he is a classically trained paleoanthropologist. In fact, he studies paleoanthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, which is a world leader in the study of human evolution and in study of primate anatomy. So he's got, at the time, late 50s, early 60s, he's got as cutting edge an education in paleoanthropology as you can get anywhere in the world. Studied with some of the famous teachers, scientists. He's no slouch. He's no crackpot. He's an egghead. He's trained, academically trained. And so he decides, this kind of interests him. And then there is this story that comes out of Washington. Remember, Krantz is in California. The story comes out of Washington from a tiny little forest village called Bossburg, and two of them, Bossburg and Colville, that giant footprints have been found in the snow. It's around Thanksgiving near these two little towns. And Krantz is, the school's closed for vacation, for Thanksgiving vacation. So he hops in his car and he heads out there to look around. And he gets there, and there's people all over the place. And he goes and he looks at some of these footprints. And he notices that there's a pair of footprints that, beside being huge, have some sort of strange anatomical features to them. There are, on one of the feet, these two big bulges that stick out of the side. Now remember, Krantz is a trained anatomist. He's dissected humans, he's dissected primates, he knows his stuff. And he decides that the only way this foot, because by now a lot of people are saying, oh, these things are fake. People are creating, footprints to fool you. He decides the only way a print like this could have been created was if it was a live animal that at some point in the past had badly injured its foot, broken its foot, broke the bones in its foot, so now they're sticking out of the side, but it has since healed. And right there, right at that moment, that's when he decides these creatures are real. Because there's no way a hoaxer, in his mind, there's no way a hoaxer could fake this. Now, there's a photograph out there, which you can find without too much trouble, of Grover Krantz at Bossberg, kneeling down in the snow. And these prints you could clearly see this is the one that's crippled. This particular animal, they start to call it the cripple foot. Instead of Bigfoot, a cripple foot. And he's kneeling in the snow staring at these footprints. And this is one of those moments that historians love. There is this photographic record. The moment before the photograph was taken, he doesn't believe Bigfoot's real. The moment the photograph is taken, as he's staring at this, as he sees the deformity in this footprint, boom, he's now convinced these things are real. So it's this, incredibly lucky chance that a picture was taken of him, and you can almost, hear in his brain saying, this is real, this can't be fake. And so he spends the rest of his career trying to prove that Bigfoot is real. And he's special because he's one of the few trained scientists who are willing to say this publicly. He goes on TV. He's on Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World. He goes on In Search Of, saying, these creatures are real. And he becomes sort of a lightning rod for both the amateurs and professionals. Professional scientists are like, dude, why are you saying this? These aren't real. You're going to ruin your career doing this. But that's what he does. He spends his career trying to prove that Bigfoot is real based on this one track, because if there's one, there's no such thing, in the sort of the tradition of monsters, there's one monster that runs around doing everything. But scientists, biologists know that you can't have one animal. Like if the Loch Ness Monster is real, which it probably isn't, but if the Loch Ness Monster is real, there isn't going to be just one of them. There's going to be a whole population of them, because you got to keep the thing going. You got to keep making little Loch Ness monsters. And so that's the way it is with Bigfoot. If it's real, which it probably isn't, but if it's real, there's got to be whole populations of these things running around. And Krantz understands that. And so he spends his career trying to prove this.
So you also got to actually sit down and look at his notebooks.
Yes.
Letters on it. I mean, what was it, what was it like going through all of this? What was it like being able to see inside of his head?
Yeah, well, this is what historians do. We track down the letters. Luckily, some people leave behind lots of material. Some people don't leave behind anything. One of the unspoken laws of history is that we only really remember people who leave stuff behind. Like, if you don't leave anything behind, we're never going to remember you. We're never going to know you were there, even though you are there, obviously. But there are some people, Hitler, for example, or Napoleon. We know literally what these guys were doing every minute of every day of their lives. There's that much material exists. Charles Darwin left behind huge amounts of letters. In fact, the Cambridge University, for years, they've been putting out the collected letters called the Darwin Correspondence. It's up to 30 volumes. That's how much stuff he left behind. And Krantz had tons of stuff he left behind. And that's how I was able to write this book in such detail, because not only are his letters there, but there's letters from his great nemesis, Rennie DeHinden, from John Green, from all the, if you know the history of cryptozoology in the 20th century, all the big names, their material is in this collection because they were all exchanging letters, and some of them liked each other, some of them hated each other. I always refer to Rennie DeHinden as the anti-Krantz, because these two guys just hated one another. DeHinden was this really fascinating, in some ways even more fascinating than Krantz. He was this guy from Switzerland who, as a kid, he lives through World War II, and the war's over, and his mother puts him up for adoption, and he winds up getting bounced around from one foster family to another, never really being treated very well. He develops this really almost aggressive sense of individualism, and he winds up leaving Europe, and he winds up in Canada, in Western Canada, just when all this Sasquatch stuff is kind of coming out. He gets fascinated by it, and he starts studying it. The problem is he has no education. I mean, literally no education. He's totally self-taught. And along comes Grover Krantz, who's got a PhD in paleoanthropology, is classically trained. And DeHinden hates Krantz in part because he's envious of Krantz's education and his position. But having said that, Rennie DeHinden, he's a smart guy. He's a naturally smart guy, and he comes up with a lot of stuff. And in the end, he too begins to doubt whether these creatures are real. There's this letter I found, a letter he sent to Krantz, which is like almost heartbreaking, because this guy has spent his whole adult life chasing Bigfoot. He believes it's real. He's seen footprints. He was there at Bossburg. He saw the Cripplefoot tracks. That's where he meets. That's where Krantz and him meet. Years and years and years go by, and he writes this letter in which he says, I'm paraphrasing here. He says, I basically wasted my entire life looking for this thing that doesn't exist. I mean, that takes a lot of, I don't know, fortitude to admit that this thing that you staked your whole life on was a lot of crap. And so all these people were exchanging letters with Krantz, and so that's how this thing is this huge collection. And I was the first one to look at it, and I think I'm the only one to ever look at it. I don't know if anyone since I came along who's ever gone and looked at this material, which is odd because you got all these people running around claiming, "Oh, I'm a cryptozoologist," and my great critique of cryptozoologists is that they're totally focused on going out into the field and capturing a live animal. And what I've always said is that you're not going to find these creatures out in the woods. You're going to find them in the library. You're going to find them in the archives. That's where the material is. Because when I first started doing this project, I thought, okay, I got the Krantz stuff. That's great. But there probably isn't any other collections like this. And then I began to realize there actually are a number of them. There is a file cabinet full of material at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, which is literally labeled Bigfoot file. And again, I think I'm the only person who has ever looked at this. There are collections in England that you can look at about people who looked at this stuff, and their letters and their notebooks and things are there. It's there. You cryptozoologists who are watching this, this is what you have to do. Stop wandering around in the woods. You're not going to find the Jersey Devil wandering around in the woods. You got to go to the library. You got to go to the archives. You got to search the material. You have to read what we historians call primary sources. That's where you're going to discover this. And most
That
cryptozoologists just don't do it.
that is wild. That yeah, there really is. So in the wake of all of this Bigfoot research and cryptozoology research, especially with professionals like Grover Krantz getting involved, was aside from probably some incredibly entertaining media, were there other things that came out from it? Like, was there scientific changes? Was there technological changes? Was there new ways of how we do research?
Well, that's a really good question, because if you look at, excuse me, if you look at the history of science in general, again, going all the way back to the classical world, in their searches for monstrous creatures, all those Greeks and Romans and other early medieval scholars, they didn't find any they figured that the Scipodii don't exist. And all those the guys with the giant feet and the no heads but the faces and the chest, all they don't exist. But in their search for these creatures, they invented biology, they invented zoology, they invented ornithology, they invented geology. They basically invented all of the modern biological sciences. They didn't find monsters, but they found this other stuff. Cryptozoologists, unfortunately, not so much. As far as I know, no cryptozoologists have ever actually added any new knowledge to science. Now, that doesn't mean they won't in the future, but up to this point, as far as I know, they haven't added anything,
That's
which
why
upsets me because I wish they would.
we need to invent a
Look,
new monster, Brian. That's what we have
yeah,
to do.
I would love to. I know lots of historians. I know lots of archaeologists. I know lots of paleontologists. I know people who study dinosaurs for a living. Every single one of them would love to find out that Bigfoot was real.
It is
But so far, nothing.
crazy.
And we're never really going to know. The way to prove that Bigfoot's real is someone someday is going to have, and Grover Krantz suggested this, and he got a lot of crap for it from cryptozoologists. He said, you want to prove Bigfoot is real? Shoot one.
There is actually a TV show, and the people being followed by the camera crew
Uh-huh.
are specifically going out with the intention of shooting Bigfoot.
Right, because if you do, I know it sounds cruel, because if these things are real, it would probably go on an endangered species list in about 2 seconds. But you have to have what's called a type specimen. You have to have one that proves beyond the shadow of a doubt this species is real. And the only way, photographs aren't going to do it, video footage is not going to do it, footprints are not going to do it. You're going to have to shoot one, bring it into a major university biology lab, throw it on a dissecting table, cut it open, and then we'll know Bigfoot's real. And unless that happens, we're never going to really know.
That, yeah, wild.
And Krantz was saying that. He's, look, there isn't just one of these. If it's real, there's going to be a bunch of them. Shoot one. That way we know it's real, and then we can sort of create rules and laws about what you can and can't do. You can't shoot them, endangered species, et cetera, et cetera. And cryptozoologists sent him tons of hate mail and you bastard, how could you say this? But that is the sad reality of how we determine if a living thing is real, if a mysterious creature is real, because that's what the definition of a cryptid is. It's an animal which is known only from folklore.
Proven otherwise.
Right.
I
For a
don't.
long time, the gorilla was a cryptid. There were legends about gorillas, but until a body was brought in and they said, "Oh, look, this thing's real." There are all sorts of examples of that.
Yeah. Okay. So, in the wake of it all, what would you say, kind of to help wrap it up, is the legacy of Grover Krantz?
Well, he proved that scientists could believe this material. Scientists could accept the fact that cryptids are real, that scientists don't just immediately dismiss all of this. If you're familiar with the story of the Minnesota Iceman, for example, this was a supposed creature that was discovered in a carnival exhibition in Minnesota, looking kind of like a Neanderthal, was in a block of ice. But Ivan Sanderson and Bernard Hoovelmans were two of the first cryptozoologists to go and look at this thing. And it seemed so convincing that the Smithsonian Institution got involved and wanted to buy this frozen body from the carnival guy who had it so they could study it and put it on display and prove that this creature is real. The FBI even got involved because if you see photographs of this thing, it's in a block of ice. The head, it kind of looks like a Neanderthal. The head's kind of got like a wound on its forehead or something on its forehead, which somebody thought proved that somebody had shot this thing, and that's how they captured it. And so when the scientists at the Smithsonian wanted to look at this thing, they said, this thing looks like it was shot. They call the FBI, and the FBI gets involved. And I think what happened is the Minnesota Iceman was fake. Right from the get-go, it was a carnival sideshow wheeze to bring in the rubes, to get money. And the guy who had it, when the scientists and then the Smithsonian, then the FBI got it, he freaked out. He didn't want to. He was in too far. He couldn't say, "Oh my God, what are they going? They're going to throw me in jail for killing a fake dummy." And so the whole thing just kind of went away. But scientists want to think these things are real, because like any of us, who wouldn't want to know that UFOs are real? Who wouldn't want to know the Jersey Devil was real? Who wouldn't want to know ghosts were real? But at this point in time, there's no evidence for any of it.
All right. Thank you, Brian.
Any more things, belief systems of yours that I can eviscerate and ruin for you?
Eviscerate or ruin in the most entertaining way.
There's no Santa Claus either.
There's no Santa Claus.
I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings. I'm just telling you what's what.
Yeah, but that's what makes it fun. Is there's all sorts of there's always all sorts of fun history in the process.